And we knew that by when they used to ask other bands into the control rooms that were working in the complex of the studios to come and listen to a finished track that we made. And Richard and I used to look at the band's faces who were asked to come in and listen to a track, and at the end of the track they were just dumbfounded. They could never ever believe what they just heard. And that's the way it was. I mean, you had to, and that's going back those 50 years. I mean, you know, that was the progression of music, but there was nothing like it.
So, what was it to your mind about it that was just so different?
Well, it was just looking for something different from all aspects, from the way they were writing, the way we approached the album technically, because a gauntlet was thrown to me after we finished the Revolver album, and they went on tour and couldn't recreate any of the songs on tour from the Revolver album. So John came into the control room on that first day and said, we're never going to tour again, and we're going to make an album that's going to have sounds on it and things on it that no one's ever heard before. And everyone looked at me, and I know what I've got nothing, you know, except from Revolver, you know, to get some of the things on Revolver right, to abuse the equipment, and got into trouble sometimes from the management. Had to be a bit careful.
Well, how tight was EMI in terms of standards and what you could and couldn't do?
Well, the thing was, it was classically based at that time. It was they recorded a lot of, you know, Maria Callas and Elizabeth Schwarzkopf and all those wonderful people and conductors. It was classical, and the pop people were like the dregs, you know, the artists and that, but except their records paid for the classical sessions. So it was an upper crust sort of attitude from the classical people and a lot of older people. You know, we were like the first young generation that had entered into Abbey Road, or EMI as it was then.
So let me take that as a cue. So when you first met the Beatles,
right,
what did you think of them?
Well, I was learning the ropes when I first started, and 2 days later they came in to record their first single, which ended up being Love Me Do. And I said, it wasn't How Do You Do It? They came in to do a Mitch Murray song and they didn't like doing it. And that's when John said, we want to do one of our own. But I said to the guy that was teaching me, Richard, not Richard Lush, but another Richard, I'll ask the management, can I sit in or stand in on that session to see how it was? Because they were just a band from Liverpool that people saying, they'd been in for their artist test with Repeat Best and stuff, and for some reason they were bound. I don't know. There was an attitude. They were the kids and mop tops, and they were different from Cliff Richard and the Shadows. Let's put it that way. So, anyway, the second day I started, they came in to record that record. And I said, "Can I, just be in the control room and watch the ropes, see what my job's going to be?" You know, which was operating the tape machines. You know, we didn't start in the library then. You know, we went straight in as the second engineer. So then, you know, I'm looking down, and you know, the first thing is they got their attire was the thin, you know, ties and the jackets and stuff, and they were different. You know, it was like anti-establishment, I guess, at that time, because we were like the first generation after the Second World War that had any money in our pockets, I guess, and of course we were not revolting, but we were anti-establishment in our own sense. I mean, Carnaby Street came into being, and there was an air of sort of freedom, I guess. So
but there was humour too, wasn't there?
Oh yeah, well yeah. I mean, exactly. They were funny because I guess it was the Liverpool humour, but they reacted to each other in a funny manner with a lot of, you know, rapport going on. And George Martin's like the schoolmaster, you know, with his tie and his jacket and very stern. And that's how it was. I mean, you know, and before you used to start recording, there'd be the buzzer was for the classical, but you'd put the red light on so that they knew the tape was going, and they all got nervous, and you know. But it was I know the Beatles themselves have referred to George, you know, as the schoolmaster.
So let's go to that point in time, late in '66,
yeah,
where Sgt Pepper starts to get recorded.
Mm-hmm.
Did you have any hint about how extraordinary this record was going to be at that point on that first day? Yeah,
well, the first day we just started Strawberry Fields. I mean, that was the hint. And as you know, Strawberry Fields and Penny Lane were going to go on with the intention. It didn't have a title at that time. It was going to be a collection of songs and tracks, you know, to make this album. So it eventually became Sgt Pepper. It didn't start off as Sgt Pepper. So Strawberry Fields was the first track we started to record, and it was lost as a single because EMI were desperate for a single.
So there you are sitting there, and John and the others turn to you essentially, and they're saying, "You've got to get the sounds we want." How did you feel?
Oh, they didn't know what they wanted, except they wanted different sounds. So I'm doing all manner of things. I mean, we'd never, once we'd done something, we always strive to get, if we recorded something in a certain way, just as an example, if the piano had been mic'd on the top, for the next song, because I used to listen to it as they were rehearsing the song, and sort of, because the way I work is like painting a picture in tonalities and stuff, and there's a certain sound I might pick up on while they're routining it. So for instance, is the next time I'm going to mic the piano differently, so I might mic it from underneath, which no one would do, you know. So all the time I'm looking for different, you know, ways of doing things. And there was an air duct under the floor which used to sort of resonate, and I think I taped a little thin condenser mic on the floor over the air duct, which you could hear the drums sometimes, and a lot of close miking with little condenser mics, really, really close onto things. As you know, there's like little harpsichord noises, and George had that little instrument called the Virginal, I think it was. It was like a practice piano. It was about that long, and just had one little thin string on it. You could play it, and you know, I used to put the mic just there, you know, and it sounded amazing. I'm quite sure on Lucy in the Sky there's a lot of that. I can't remember now, but all the time we were just looking and looking and looking, you know, for new ways of doing things. The saving grace for me was something I've worked with on the Revolver album, which was the Fairchild 660 limiter, where that drum sound came from, where the whole drum kit went through that limiter, and it really gave that pounding, punchy sound. So guitars went through that, vocals definitely went through the Fairchild 660. So that was that made things sound really great, you know, so that was a big helping hand, you know.
So that process, when they would run through a song,
yeah,
and there you are sitting in the control room, and even as they're running through the song,
yes,
you had to start coming up with ideas.
Well, I'm thinking, yeah, absolutely.
Tell us how that worked.
Well, I mean, another example then was on Lovely Rita Mate, right? They were stuck for the solo. And in fact, I suggested the piano solo, believe it or not, because they were really in a tizwas about what solo to put on it. So then Paul shouted up, because I was at the top of the stairs, and Paul said, "Oh, you play it," right? So I'm so nervous, you know, in those days. So I said, "No, I can't do it." So thinking about it, although it sounded weird at the time to do the piano solo, it would, when you think about it, it was not going to sound right. So what I did, I wanted a shimmer behind the piano, because to get a sound of a piano that no one had heard again, because these are supposed to be all new sounds. So what I did, I used the echo chamber on it, which was at the back of number 2, and we could send the signal of the piano via a tape machine into the echo chamber, which would give some sort of delay. So what I did, I stuck sticky tape on all the guide rollers of the tape machine, so when the tape went through, it was wobbling all over the place, right? Again, if the manager had come in, I probably would have gone fired or got into terrible trouble. So it wobbled the tape going through the heads, right, of the tape machine, and wobbled the echo or the piano into the sound into the chamber, and that was like the sound behind the piano. But now you can actually get that sound as a plug-in, because most plugins now are based on the things we used to do. So that's one example, you know.
So Richard Lush and yourself,
yeah,
you're very young,
yeah,
and you're carrying all this weight.
Well, absolutely, but it was just not carrying the weight; it was a responsibility. Because Richard was the master of the automatic double tracking. He really was. I mean,
so tell us about that. How did that work?
Well, it was a little bit complicated, but it started off, first of all, that John was getting lazy, and he wanted, although both he and Paul were incredible at double tracking their voices, they could do just one pass against the first pass to get that texture, and it was spot on with the first pass, you know. And then John was getting lazy, from what I remember. He said, "Oh, I'm fed up. Why have I got to sing it again? Why haven't you got a machine that can do it?" Because he just said things. He didn't understand anything really, you know, what we were doing. So then it was Ken Townsend at EMI came up with the idea that what we would do, we could only do it when we were mixing or doing a 4-track to 4-track. So there was a thing on the multi-track machine or the 4-track machine called a sync head, which gave you the signal before the replay head. So that signal from the sync head went into a tape machine, which was on vari-speed that Richard controlled. So it was a copy of the vocal, but it was being copied before you heard it on the replay, normal replay. So you could either advance it or retard it. So if you got it spot on, it would probably phase itself. And the power supply was quite big into this tape machine that had the copy of the voice in. It needed a big, in those days, a big power unit to power the motor. And Richard had a sweep oscillator, which was quite large. It wasn't a little vernier one like they've got now. So anyway, he used to set it, and sometimes bring the image, second image, away from exactly the original image. And so we got the double track voice. Sometimes he just moved it slightly, Richard, as the voice is going through. And then what flanging was when Richard sort of just went wow like that with it, especially with guitars, to bend the copy guitar note. No one really knew what Richard was doing, and sometimes, because Richard and I used to love that, and suddenly, we'd be doing this, what was it, Any Something, we did Within You, Without You, most of those Indian instruments are automatically double tracked. But Richard, used to go berserk, and we used to love it, and John would look round and smile because he'd love it, or whatever. And George Martin say, don't like that too much, still officious, But Richard was the ace at that. It was great.
So it appears that John Lennon didn't really like his voice, so he seemed to want to disguise it. Tell us about that.
No, he just didn't like his voice. So he always wanted that what we call tape echo, which was that noise, and he used to like listening to the consonants of his voice, like the S's and the T's, in the headphones. And I think sometimes, because before he'd start singing a song, you'd hear him go, to get a sort of rhythm. It was normally a set speed. We didn't mess around on vari speed. It was 15 or 30, and he just loved it, and it helped him a lot, especially on Day in the Life. And I think we actually recorded that Twitter echo at the time of doing his vocal, because in those days, as well, being 4 tracks, you didn't say, oh, we'll do another one, we'll do another one, we'll do another one. We'd do a pass on the vocal, and we've only got maybe 2 tracks to concentrate with the vocal. So if you can only at most keep two takes of the vocal. So you want to put a third one, you've got to wipe one of them. It's gone, So most of John's vocals were done quite quickly, I think. Not many passes.
So you found a way, if you like, of making his voice acceptable to him, did you?
Well, absolutely. I mean, again, it goes back to the Revolver days because of using that Fairchild limiter. Because normally it was the regular way of recording a Cliff Richard voice per se. With I'm not knocking Cliff Richard, but that's the way that it was recorded. The mic was there, and then very little, just a little bit of limiting or whatever. But I found out that if you sort of got really sort of close and put a lot of limiting on, it really brought the voice way out, and lifted the volume of all the mouth noises and so on. And because he loved it, and when he started, because when the sort of limiters stopped limiting and he'd stopped singing, he made mouth noises. They were amplified to a large level. So they used to love all that,
So tell us about George Martin's role in all this. You alluded to the fact that he would sometimes turn to you. It's been written down. I think Richard said that when you put too much flanging on,
yes,
that Martin would react in a certain way. What would he do?
Well, his catchphrase was "Oh, honestly." I don't know whether Richard said that, but George would say, "Oh, honestly, Richard," something like that. And so he was still at that time very officious. Whereas, we sort of respected the officiousness, but see, George developed that. He wasn't brought up like that. He developed that, that wasn't his real true character, But today he just, honestly, I guess he would say, that's what I was saying, when Richard used to go overboard, and even Lennon loved what we were doing on his guitar with it, boing, like this, and Richard go berserk, And then George would hear it and, as I said, very officious and not really like it, I guess. I don't know.
And during those Sgt Pepper sessions, what was the sort of the interplay between you and George Martin?
There wasn't a lot of interplay. George, obviously, it was taking a long time to, record the basic rhythm track once the instrumentation had been sorted out as to what instruments are going to play. So after that, there wasn't a lot except for George to sit there and listen to the various takes, and if there was a problem, speak to them and so forth, and help pick the correct take. I mean, you know, it was all, you know, we were all in it together, you know. Sometimes
sessions obviously would go late at night into the morning.
Yes.
How did you guys all stay awake?
No, well, we eventually through I don't know at what stage, I guess it must have been, I don't know, a third of the way in. We were starting at like 4 in the afternoon and working till maybe 5 or 6 in the morning possibly, and then we used to go home, sleep and get in for 4 in the afternoon.
And did you need something to keep awake?
No, not at all. No, well, except I did find out, I was pretty good at that, but I did find out from Jerry Beckley, who was the singer from America, and he knew Mal Evans, and Mal Evans had told him that he used to drop things in my tea and George Martin's tea, or probably Richard's tea, and we were completely unaware of that.
To keep you awake?
Yeah, to keep us awake. Yeah. Because we knew what was going on with the drug situation with them, because they erected their little area with screens and stuff in number 2, so they couldn't be seen from the control room, you know.
So tell us about that, because Pepper, more than most albums in musical history, has an association with mind-altering drugs.
Yeah.
Were the Beatles smoking a bit of dope?
Well, yeah, they were, but the other things that they were taking, we knew they probably were taking other things, but we were sort of, in a sense, unaware of it. Well, I mean, you know, Richard and I probably had more insight than George, possibly. He may have been a little ignorant. But yes, I mean, there was one occasion, which is really funny actually. They'd try anything, and I don't know which track it was, and one that they came in about 7 o'clock or 8 o'clock one night to do some vocal overdubs, or they'd been somewhere, I can't remember. And the idea was to get a strobe light going in the studio. So, because they're moving around in number 2 studio with the strobe going, and it looks like one of those old Charlie Chaplin films, and because within 10 minutes they've all got migraines. And they would like to go home. I mean, they'd try anything.
Oh, that's fantastic.
Yeah.
So when you say that George Martin wasn't too sure what was going on...
Oh no, in what respect?
In terms of them smoking dope and...
No, we knew they were smoking, because Mal had started lighting joss sticks and stuff like that. We knew that was going on, but the outside, I mean, they were pretty well behaved in the studio. I mean, they worked really, really hard. And especially Ringo. I mean, anyway, I'll get onto that in a minute. But no, they really worked hard, and obviously they smoke a couple of joints maybe. But I mean, that was the end of it really, and they kept themselves really together. When they had the most fun was when they were doing the vocals around the vocal mic, because as soon as they got around the vocal mic, then they started giggling and laughing, and everything started falling apart. You know, they'd get halfway through a vocal, and then Paul might start laughing if they were doing like harmony vocals, or John might start laughing, because you know, on the mic that we used, in most instances, if it was like harmony vocals, it was a mic that's on what we call figure of 8, so it's live both sides, so they're looking at each other. And that's how comes, you know, the development of the giggles started, because they're looking at each other. So they're trying to keep a straight face, you know.
So let's talk about each of them. The Beatles. You talked about Ringo and the hard work.
No, yeah. I just mention that because sometimes he gets overlooked, because, you know, we had like his little drum booth, and you know, as I said earlier, you know, we keep changing the rhythm of the songs. They might try it 4 hours one way and not be happy with the rhythm or so forth, and then they try it another way. And but he'd be drumming from this time that we started, you know, to routine the song, you know, for a long time, 8 hours maybe, and the session was always over normally when you see Ringo stand up at 4 in the morning maybe, at 4 in the morning, and put his coat on, and that, you know, that he didn't say anything. You know, the others were talking, or we just finished another take or something, and he'd be so tired he'd just stand up and put his coat on, and you know that was the end of the session, you know.
Now, if you had a favourite out of all the Beatles, who did you find yourself drawn to?
Oh, well, Paul, obviously. I mean, Paul was the musician's musician, and I think Paul had an understanding of what I was doing as well, because he knew I was into instruments and so forth, you know, listening to musical instruments and crafting them, let's put it that way.
And did he drive Pepper to your mind, the concept?
Well, he was the one that always wanted 110%, and which is like the acceptance of a take. But I think the concept of Pepper must have started about maybe halfway through the album, and then you know, I know, being working on it, I wasn't aware of this. You know, people keep, you know, you see articles about it that John thought of it as Paul's album, you know, and didn't like it. I don't know whether Richard said that. Well, that's what was happening. And you know, it. What happened? In fact, the idea was you were supposed to on one session there was some sort of explanation from Paul possibly about the album, and the idea was that you were sitting in the audience listening to your part in this album. You're sitting in a theatre as a part of an audience, and the songs all the songs come on, and they're all on stage. So when after there's, I don't know, on the intro on the Sgt Pepper track, you know, Sgt Pepper's no. It goes into Billy Shears, and I know you can hear it on whichever the stereo or the mono. You hear the audience laugh, and then because we were flying these sound effects in, you know, the audience and bits, and there's a little laughter in there. Paul must have made it right. Well, that's when, you know, Ringo comes on stage to sing Billy Shears, and he trips up and falls over. That's why the audience laugh. So every song is like a different act that comes on stage. That was the perception, but that's never really been put in print anywhere, I don't think. So that was one. That was one.
Yeah. So to the other side of the equation, John. How
Right.
would you describe him to work with?
Well, I mean, John could be. He was just the brash guy. It was very strange because he could be rude and cynical, and it wasn't terribly nice to me sometimes. I mean, one of the reasons I left in the White Album was certain things that he'd been saying and stuff. So he was just he was just brash, I guess, and he couldn't explain himself properly. You know, he had ideas, but he didn't know how to project the idea or tell you the idea that he was hearing. So he described it in some ways like the Dalai Lama, you know, singing, I want my voice to sound like the Dalai Lama on a mountaintop, which happened on the Revolver album. So that's the way he used to tell you what he wanted, you know.
Right. And tell me this though, that in the Pepper sessions, there still seems to be that marvellous combination of the two working together, Lennon and McCartney. Was that right?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, my theory is, I mean, because they were both opposites. I mean, Paul was the romantic, for want of a better word, and John was the aggressive guy, and you know, the rough and tumble type guy. So the combination of those, you know, those two things made the arrangements and made those songs and the tracks the way they are.
The ultimate expression of that probably is Day in the Life, where there are two songs.
Yeah.
When John first played you Day in the Life, what was your reaction?
Oh, well, unbelievable, because I was down in the studio and he strummed it through to George Martin, you know, because he came in with the song and we started from scratch, and I went up into the control and I said to Richard, you wait till you hear this. You know, it was because of the feeling that John could put into a vocal. And my theory again on this was the fact that being the guy, the bashful guy he was and rough and ready, when he came to do a vocal track, he got this emotion into his vocals. So it was like two different people. So I thought, well, and I could never figure it out. And it was only a long time after, you know, we finished, you know, many years after, I guessed it was he used to think of his childhood. And then by doing that, it gave him the emotion to be able to sing those songs, because they were two different people.
At almost every point of A Day in the Life, there's a kind of technical innovation that you needed to develop to give them the sound they wanted. Right. How did that go? I mean,
the first time I heard it, you know, John was playing the song to George Martin in the studio, and I went up the stairs to tell Richard, you know, you wait till you hear this, it's unbelievable, and feeling the emotion from the way he was singing the song. And at that time, all John had was the verses, and he had in his own mind in a sense, the finished thing, because he knew there were going to be gaps of 24 bars within the song, and there was another little gap So anyway, we did the basic thing. And I was going to also get the best drum sound ever recorded, because we're going back 50 years now, right? And I'll remind me about the drum sound in a minute. So we got the gaps. So I don't know when Paul's song went in, but it was a question of, well, what can we put in that gap? And Paul said, well, I've got a song which I haven't really finished, which was Woke Up, Got Out of Bed, so we'll put that in there. So none of this was like outside of the studio constructed. It all came piecemeal, built up in the studio. So anyway, I woke up, got out of bed. John must have done his lead vocal, because that vocal track of Paul's went onto the same vocal track as John. Because when Paul sings the word dream, probably Richard may have mentioned this to you, Paul sings the word dream at the end of his song, John's voice is at that point. So Paul we told Paul to keep the dream as a short word, because otherwise we would have wiped John's vocal beginning. So when all hell would have, because we haven't got more tracks, right? So then in the other bigger tracks, the orchestral things, cacophony. So then they're standing there, and someone said, "Oh, what about a 90-piece orchestra?" So then George Martin, knowing he's got a budget, which is ridiculous to think about, EMI's budget, says, no, we can't afford a 90-piece orchestra. We'll have that. So Ringo then said, well, let's have a 45-piece orchestra and put it on twice. Right? So everyone sort of sniggered and smiled. So anyway, we're going to have this cacophony. So what we decided to do with the 45-piece orchestra, for the first time, was to link two 4-track machines together in some really primitive fashion. So the first orchestral take was put onto track 4 of the first 4-track, which made it completely in sync with the rhythm and the because that was everything was else apart from the orchestra was finished on that tape, because all our finished sounds were always recorded onto the tape. We didn't do a lot afterwards on the mix. They were always finished as they were recorded. So we then had put on a second machine with another 4 tracks. And no one told the orchestra, because it was, well, if you'd have told the orchestra you were doing that, you would have had to have paid them extra money. But eventually they found out, and they were actually paid. So we did another take and recorded this next orchestral pass on track 1 of the second 4-track, then another pass on the second, another pass on the third, another on the fourth. And both motors in the tape machines were pulsed by the same 50-cycle pulse, so the motors were going at the same speed. You had to put like a grease pencil mark on the tape, so you started them together, one in record, one on play, And then at the end of that, because John wanted the orchestra to have funny noses and glasses and God knows what else, and tuxedos, and the orchestra were really fed up. They hated this session, and the score was just 24 bars, 1 note here you start with, and 1 note at the end on the last bar. And the instruction was, well, you start on this note, and then in your own time, you reach that note, in over 24 bars. They said, we can't do that. We've got to have it written. So, George Martin spent like 20 minutes explaining to them. They're still saying, no, we can't do it. We want it written. But the idea was, you don't listen to the man sitting next to you. You just go from that note to that note in your own time. So you get all this noise and cacophony. And it was David Mason who played the bark trumpet on Penny Lane, who was in the orchestra, and Alan Civil, who played the French horn on For No One, who were like the main great brass players in the classical orchestras then. And they said, no, come on lads, come on, we can do this, because they had a little relation there, those two members, because they played on Beatle records before. And because what happened, what we're now doing is seeing the breakdown between the classical and the pop people. This was the beginning of that happening. But although it was really under tension that night. So anyway, eventually they do that. They play the part, and because it sounds amazing. And then Paul had the idea, which is now the piano chord at the end. As there were so many guests around, there were some of the Rolling Stones and some of the Monkees, and there was a lot of people around. So it was like a party going on in the studio when we were doing the orchestra. So Paul said, let's try someone going on like that on the end. So we played the track back out into the studio, and all the people that were around did this on, but it didn't work. So eventually, 2 weeks later, we put the 4 pianos on, and George Martin was doing the harmonium. There's a slight buzz under that chord, which has sort of disappeared a bit when they tried to clean it up. So and there's a little squeak, because as that piano chord hit, I started to lift the volume of the microphones. It was always feedback to the control room. And at the it was like the longest real piano chord you've ever heard as it died away. And at the very end, Ringo moved his foot, and you hear this little squeak. You can hear it in some versions. And Paul glared at Ringo, you know. So the drum sound on that also was, we're going for the best drum sound ever recorded. So what I did for the first time was to take the bottom skins off the tom-toms, and I put microphones in glass jugs wrapped in a tea towel underneath the toms. The theory being that you hit, you know, the attack comes from the top, you know, skin, and the tonality comes from the bottom. So that's what I did. And I tried a few other things, maybe for the first time a mic under the snare. I'm not quite sure. But anyway, I did mic it in a different way because it was going to be the best drum sound ever, which it was then classed as being the best drum sound ever. So that's how all this stuff came. We try as hard as we could to make the next song even better than the song before, you know.
So when you played A Day in the Life back,
oh right, yeah, right.
What was the reaction?
Yeah, so Richard and I set up a rough monitor mix that night after the session, and the control room, it was #1 studio in Abbey Road, or EMI as it was there, and I keep saying that. So a few of you know, everyone was just trying to cram in there, you know, a lot of the guests that had been asked, and Richard and I sort of set it up, and we played it back. And it was like going from square black and white film into CinemaScope Technicolor, although it was just mono. And there was absolute silence at the end of it. Again, no one had ever heard anything like it in their lives. And Ron Richards was sitting down here by the side of the mixing console, and Ron was the producer of the Hollies. And Ron had his head in his hands, and he said, "I'm going to give the business up." He said, "There's no way I could ever get anywhere near this, you know." And he was really down. But no, it was, you had to, I know it's easy to say what it was like, but you had to experience being there the night we played that rough monitor mix back. It was just incredible.
Now, the context of all this is that Paul McCartney, certainly, and Brian Wilson,
yes,
and the Beach Boys were in competition with each other.
Yeah.
When you played back A Day in the Life,
yeah,
was there a sense from Paul or John that they'd lived up to that challenge of Pet Sounds?
I've got no idea. The Pet Sounds issue is all very vague to me, because I know there's all this, you know, Paul had a disc player or record player in the studio and he was playing Pet Sounds and blah, 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 which I really wasn't aware of. I mean, I really wasn't aware of any of this. And it was never really mentioned in front of us about this Pet Sounds thing, you know. It's sort of grown out of all proportion. I don't know. I mean, Paul obviously talks about it, but it was I was never aware of this comparison between us and Pet Sounds at that time, to be honest with you.
Well, it didn't matter in the end, because the reaction to Sgt Pepper was so fantastic. 50 years on, do you think it stood the test of time?
Well, of course. I mean, it's unbelievable. You know, and I know that I won't even go there because I'm disgusted about this reissue. But I mean, because it was so diverse, the stereo, you know, the extreme left and rights and so forth, you know, Brian Wilson hears it and thinks that's deliberate, which it wasn't. It was the only way we could mix it. It wasn't recorded in stereo, it was recorded in mono, and this is the way, it's the only thing you could do, make it so diverse left and right and centre. But Brian thought that was deliberate, obviously. But of course, yes, it stood the test of time.
When you listen back to the album now, what's your reaction?
No, great. I mean, I play the mono CDs. That's about the only thing I can play now. I mean, that's not too bad. I mean, those reissued stereo ones were just, they cleaned it up so much that a lot of the textures, see, it was an artistic thing to us. As far as I was concerned, it's like painting a picture with paints and a certain tonality, colours in those, and textures in those paints. So when for instance, what happened when I was doing something for Naris or something, if we dubbed a cowbell on, you know, their attitude was, well, we don't want it to sound like a cowbell. I mean, if we put a guitar, I'm trying to make it not sound like a guitar, right? All the time this was going on. So we overdubbed a cowbell once, and obviously a cowbell sounds dreadful, so I think I slashed tons and tons and tons of high end out of it, put lots of bottom in it, you know, and it didn't really sound like a cowbell anymore, which was the idea. So someone came up to us at one of these talks one day after these reissues. I don't know when those reissues came out. They said, "Yeah, I like it." She said, "There's a sound on that record. I never knew what it was, right? And because they've cleaned it up, And she said, I know it's a cowbell now. You know, well, the thing was, you weren't supposed to know it was a cowbell, you know. So all these reissue things, it's all based on technical things. The artistic thing has been completely ignored as to how it was made, you know, and for how it was made.
So let's set that aside. When you go back to the work that you produced, both the mono and stereo,
yeah,
and you look back at them now, what are the words you have to describe it as an achievement?
I'm just proud of it, I guess, because of what it is. As I said, when we finished it, we knew that it was perfect and it was special, but in what way we didn't know that it was going to get bigger and bigger and bigger every week, even in 50 years' time. You know, it's still, you know, I'm just proud of it, to be honest with you. That's all I can say.
That's all you need to say.
Yeah.
That's wonderful.
Yeah.
I want to just ask one more question, because one of the things we've been doing in Australia for the ABC,
right,
and I've been involved in this, is just a reflection on some of our great pop artists of the 60s. And you talked about Paul McCartney, but I just wanted to ask you, how would you describe Paul McCartney and his contribution to modern music?
Oh, I mean, I know we shouldn't really use the word genius, because I know we once, but he was in the control room with George Martin and myself when we were doing the Tug of War album, and we started to talk about, you know, he was on whatever track it was we'd done on Tug of War and the way it was structured, and so forth. And we made the remark that, you know, you're a genius, Paul, and he said, no, I'm not a genius. He didn't want to accept that. Because, you know, genius is a funny word. You know, I mean, Albert Einstein was a genius possibly, but to start relating it into music's a bit different. And really, so he's like all the old incredible songwriters, you know, Irving Berlin and all those people. I mean, you know, you can't touch him. I mean, from some of those songs that he's written, they're just unbelievable.
What was he like to work with? Exciting?
Yeah, yes, I mean, it could be exciting. There's one document, it was called One Hand Clapping. This little, I don't know if you've ever seen that, and it was done in number 2 Abbey Road. It was when he was with Wings, and it was just after we'd done Band on the Run, and this little thing was called One Hand Clapping, and we just recorded it live, some tracks off of Band on the Run, and there was Jimmy and a guy called Geoff, who was the drummer then, and Denny and Linda. And the energy in these songs are just amazing. To think that, you know, he's just, I mean, it's one of those things that not many people know of, that little documentary, but when you hear these performances, it's just incredible. It's just...
What was it about him that made him great to work with? Was he demanding?
No, he wasn't. No, he knew what he wanted. You know, I mean, and I guess we got on well together because he liked it. He knew how I functioned, you know, and how I could interpret his songs, you know, and record them basically.
And I think it's been suggested that John was a rival with him. Did you sense that rivalry between them?
No, not really. I mean, I think George Martin was more aware of that from a political point of view than I was, because, you know, George was thinking of the politics involved with who's got this song, who's got that song, you know, and so forth on the album. Yeah.
But what an incredible combination.
Well, yeah. I mean, it'll never. I mean, it'll never. It might happen again in 200 years. Let's think about it in that way. I mean, Mozart was probably the pop guy of his day. He wasn't classical in his day, he was pop music. And then, you know, the Beatles came along as what they are. And I think it's going to be many, many, many years before anything, if ever, would materialise like the Beatles have or McCartney has.
Geoff Emerick, thank you very much for talking.
That's a pleasure. That's great. Thank you.